going to be recorded. So please, if you don't want to be on the recording, please turn your camera off. But saying that, we do encourage as many of you as possible just to keep your cameras on so we can see one another. It makes a more collaborative space. So we're going to record this event for future viewing as an educational resource. So that will be available on our YouTube channel. And we will make a copy of the slides available for you in PDF after the event. So you can really focus on this bite-sized piece of training that we're going to be providing today, and really focus rather than scribbling notes. Any screenshots from the event we will use in our future communications, so thinking about LinkedIn, any of our reports. So if you don't want to be in the chat, if you don't want to be in the photos, please just pop in the chat and we'll make sure you are not shown in any way. If you use social media, LinkedIn or whatever, please use hashtag Dorset Innovation Hub and spread the work about what we're doing together. We aim to finish this community of practice at 1:55 to 2:00, so we can get you off for your 2 o'clock meeting or lunch, whichever it is. So next slide, please. Thank you. So my name's Sarah Chesil. I'm Head of Research and Innovation at NHS Dorset. And coming across to Michelle.
Hi there, my name is Michelle Holmes. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Workforce Development at Health Sciences University, working as part of the education team within the Dorset Innovation Hub.
Thanks, Michelle. Coming to Sandra.
Hello everyone, my name is Sandra Courtier and I work within NHS Dorset as a Research and Innovation Programme Manager and likewise supporting the Dorset Innovation Hub within the Education Group.
Thanks, Sandra. Next slide, thank you. So today we're looking at data storytelling, and we invited you to come to this community of practice to find out more about basic principles of good data display, importance of contextualizing that data, and really tailoring narratives and visuals for different audiences. So just a reminder of why you signed up for this community of practice. Next slide, thank you. Just really quickly, you've heard us say a couple of times about the Dorset Innovation Hub. So here's a visual. So we work together, hosted by NHS Dorset. We work together with the National Health Service providers within Dorset, higher education, so the HEIs, local organisations, including the voluntary and community sector, local authorities, and that includes Dorset Police, and wider partners that you can see on the right-hand side. Next slide, thank you. And our work together is very much as a strategic system partnership, working together on prioritised innovation, taking forward prioritised projects, working collaboratively together. And that's really important. So how can we take forward innovation in a way that actually benefits our wider population? So it's not just looking at health or care, it's looking at the wider as well. So we've got the programme group, and you can see some snips of them on the left-hand side there. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the core team. So we're small and perfectly formed. We provide facilitative support and advice for innovation. And as part of that programme together, we run the education programme, as I've said. That's hosted by NHS Dorset and run in partnership with Health Sciences University. And that's how we're running this community of practice. Next slide, thank you. And just really quickly, this is just to give you a quick feel at the start of this community of practice. Further information is available on our public website, and all these links will be available on the slides and are live. So you can see key documents, case studies, other training opportunities, newsletters, blogs, news and events. One of the things I would say is just have a think about who is your innovation link within your organisation, and can you link in with them to talk about the work that you're doing so that you can highlight, you can showcase how we're making the lives of our population better within Dorset. So next slide, and over to you, Sandra. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So as we've said, today's community of practice is based on the topic of data storytelling. We have just the hour with you today, so limited time. So this will be quite a high-level overview, but hopefully there will be something new for you to take away, something to think about or something to follow up on. And to start us off, I just wanted to share with you a quote from Edward Tufte, who is recognised as a pioneer in the field of data visualization, and he's written lots and lots of books on the topic. I won't go through the quote verbatim, but just really liked the quote because it emphasizes that the quality of a visual is not necessarily judged on how stylish it is, but it's about how well the visual actually gets across to your audience the message or the understanding that you're trying to convey. So it's about how well it assists that understanding rather than how it looks. So to make sure that our visuals do assist with understanding as best as they possibly can, we need to be thinking about sticking to 4 key principles. So firstly, that we show the data. Secondly, choosing an appropriate design for that visual. Thirdly, making sure we've got data integrity. And last of all, making sure that visual is accessible. So coming to each of the principles briefly in turn. So principle 1 is show the data. And the first point on the slide is the data-ink ratio, which is a concept that was introduced by Edward Tufte. And it's defined as the proportion of ink used to present actual data compared to the total amount of ink that's used in the entire display. So the goal that we're aiming for is to maximize that data-ink ratio. So the largest share of ink on a graphic should be about the actual data itself. So it means that we're reducing the amount of ink that we're using for additional graphics or illustrations or icons that might be there just to illustrate, but don't actually directly relate to the data. The second point is about reducing clutter. So if we keep to the data ink ratio, that will support us to do that. But also perhaps thinking about not overburdening visuals with too much data. So sometimes having more than one variable on a visual is the right thing to do. It's the appropriate thing to do. But perhaps sometimes it's about challenging ourselves and taking a step back to think about whether or not that is causing confusion, and actually it would be better to split those variables across more than one chart or more than one graphic. But ultimately with principle 1, what we're aiming to do is to generate those visuals that are simple and that are clear and therefore help to support understanding. So moving on to principle 2, which is choosing an appropriate design. And there's a whole range of different chart types that are out there, and each chart type has a different purpose. So it will emphasize a different element in your data or a different relationship in your data. So we need to make sure that we're using a chart type that's appropriate for our data, but also appropriate for the message that we want to communicate. And finding what or identifying what that right chart type is about connecting the dots between the question that you want to answer and the chart that will most effectively help you to answer that question. So if we start off by defining what that question is, we're then looking within that question for what key words there are, what key concepts there may be that help to indicate the category of chart that we need to be picking a chart type from. So when we talk about categories of charts, we are looking across things like comparisons, the things that are there to display comparisons. There's also charts that are focused on distribution, composition, relationships, trends, and things that illustrate that geographical spread. So on the slide, what I've done is include an example of one chart type for each of those categories, but recognizing that there'll be lots of other chart types within each of those. And I suppose the key is about opting for a chart within the category that you feel best fits your need, that plays to the strength that you're after, and is as simple to understand as possible. The chart type that you choose will also be dictated in part by the IT packages that you have available to you, as well as the skills that you may have or there are within your team. So thinking about charts, but also acknowledging that there's other ways to present data visually. So be that through things like infographics, or maybe something like a simple data table is sufficient for your needs. Staying with principle 2, but this time thinking about qualitative data rather than quantitative data and how best we can display that type of information. So again, there are several options we can choose from. So things like word clouds, which I would recommend are probably best for one-word responses, so qualitative data that represents one-word answers. We may have thematic maps, so if you've got your codes and your themes from your qualitative data, those thematic maps are that visual representation to organize and illustrate your themes, and they just help with identifying those patterns and those insights. Or maybe your qualitative data is related to a service user's journey through a system or a process. So maybe illustrating that journey as a timeline might be a nice way of visually conveying that information. But whatever design we choose for our qualitative data, a bit like with the quantitative data, we just need to make sure that we are keeping the context intact. Again, we're choosing that clarity over complexity and that we're matching that visual to what is needed from our audience. Principle 3 is around ensuring data integrity. And essentially with this principle, we want to ensure that our visuals are truthful, that they're clear, and that they don't mislead or cause confusion. And there are some potential pitfalls that we may inadvertently fall into which could threaten data integrity. So things that are really good to be aware of. So for example, misleading scales or axes. This can happen, for example, if you are using a chart with scales that don't have a zero baseline. Data integrity can be threatened if we're cherry picking data. So there might be one or two key things we want to highlight, but we need to make sure that that broader context of the data as a whole is also presented. It's also being mindful that some chart types in themselves can be slightly misleading or can be misinterpreted. So thinking in particular about things like scatter plots. So it's being very clear in the narrative that goes alongside scatter plots, whether or not what you're showing relates to correlation or whether it relates to causation, so that the audience doesn't go away with the wrong message. And also when we're thinking about integrity, we also need to think about color. Now, color is brilliant on visuals. It helps to bring things to life. It helps with engagement. It helps to make them a bit more enticing for the audience. But we also need to think about some colors and the inherent associations that are present with them, particularly, for example, when we think about that sort of red, amber, green traffic light symbol association. And then lastly, on principle 4, and making the visualization accessible, and staying with color. Again, color is brilliant. It does help to bring things to life and give meaning to data. But from that accessibility point of view, we also need to think about things like color blindness, and how that might affect how we use color or where we use color. So for example, I believe red and green can be quite hard to distinguish. When we think about audience, we also need to be thinking about accessibility, perhaps in terms of the level of data literacy of your audience, but also about the language that's being used. So are we using particularly complex terms? Could those be broken down into a more simplistic format just to support the accessibility of the information that you're trying to convey? Labels and keys are a key component of a visual, but when we are adding those labels and those keys, we need to make sure that the font we are using is clear, both in terms of its type and in terms of its size. Sometimes there can be a lot of information to try and squidge onto a visual, and there is a temptation there of making things super tiny. But try and avoid that as much as you can. Trying to make sure that our wording with our labels and our keys are consistent. Again, thinking about that space and how tight it can be, it can lead us to using acronyms. If we can, try to avoid using them, but it's not always possible. So if we do have to use acronyms, making sure we write those in full at least once somewhere within that visual space. And then lastly, with accessibility, don't be afraid of using white space, leaving some white space. So leaving white space between visuals and visuals, or leaving white space between visuals and text. It can just help to separate and avoids clutter and just supports the reader or your audience with digesting and understanding the information that you are trying to convey. So just a little activity to try and illustrate some of those principles in practice. So there's just a dummy example chart on the slide, and just reflecting on thinking about those 4 principles I've just talked through. Could you add to the chat your thoughts on perhaps how this particular chart could be improved? So what's missing? What could be added to it just to improve and assist understanding?
So there are some points in the chat already, Sandra. So one, Anna's saying it has no numbers. Chris has pointed out that D and C have the same slice color. There's no information about the products. No consistent use of keys. We could add quantities or percentages, more clear labeling. I like the one comment that it's boring.
Fair point, fair point.
Yeah, there's legend could improve it. No date, no time frame, inconsistent label placement, time period.
Yes, lots of quite simple things you could do just to improve and maximize the impact from that chart. And yeah, absolutely would agree with those things. So the color for product C and product D is far too similar. I think with things like pie charts, it can be very hard to accurately assess what that proportion actually means in terms of numbers. So having that extra information in terms of a value would be really helpful. And definitely that extra context information in terms of time periods and what actually those products relate to would all be really helpful to have. So moving on from visuals to thinking about the narrative itself that will accompany them. So be that as a presentation or as a report, or maybe as part of a communications tool such as a poster. So when we are building and developing that narrative that sits alongside our visuals, it can be helpful to think about creating a story framework for our data and using that traditional storytelling narrative to support with this. So for data storytelling, this could be seen as having 4 key components. So this framework having these 4 key components. So firstly, flow. So when we talk about flow, it's that smooth, continuous and logical progression of events in a narrative that helps to keep the reader engaged and immersed in the story. So flow is crucial because it enhances engagement, because it creates that sense of momentum and continuity. Secondly, when we're thinking about that framework, we need to make sure that we are providing context. Context is really key. It helps to set up that situation and explain why it's relevant. And I'm going to go into context in a bit more detail later on. The third point is heart. So heart is about revealing those insights, revealing that data that will hopefully help to transform how your audience thinks or how your audience acts. And then finally, action. So when we are presenting this data, we are generally doing it with a purpose in mind in terms of trying to increase understanding, informed decision making, help people to make those smarter decisions, or maybe it's just about starting conversations. But it's about being really clear within that storytelling framework what those actions might be that you are looking to generate from this piece of storytelling. And those could be direct actions or they could be indirect actions. But I suppose ultimately, the message I was probably trying to get across is to remember that you're the narrator of this particular story. So when you're creating it, think about creating that hook. Make sure you are guiding that flow. There's an adequate description for charts, that those key insights are highlighted and they're not lost, and that you are clearly providing that call to action, whatever that call to action might be. So thinking a little bit more about the heart element and about highlighting insights. Sometimes the most effective way of data storytelling is if we can achieve within those insights a combination of data exploration and a combination with data explanation. So a little bit of explaining the what as well as explaining the why to support that. So we can do that by presenting our narrative in a way which guides and highlights, but also encourages and supports the audience to explore and to question. And doing those type of things can be easier when we have charts or data that's flexible and interactive. But if we don't have that interactive data, we can still work towards achieving that combination of exploration and explanation by using techniques such as the use of questions and the use of problem statements. And then lastly on this slide, I've just included a second quote from Edward Tufte. Again, I'm not going to read it verbatim, but just really this quote and wanted to include it here. Because for me, this quote is encouraging us to see our audience as an active participant or an active partner in our data storytelling. And it's also reminding us of the impact and influence that we have on what those takeaway messages are going to be for the audience. So, said I wanted to come back to context. So coming back to context and focusing a little bit more on that and why it's so important in data storytelling. So when we talk about context, for me, it means that additional information that paints a much fuller picture of what your data represents, why that data matters, and maybe even some information about caveats that need to be recognized when someone's interpreting the data. But ultimately, it's that information that allows the audience to place the data in its setting and it supports the audience's understanding. So when we are thinking about context and planning to make sure that we include that information that gives that really robust context in our data story, what sort of things should we be including? So the 4 points that I put on the slide are the scope, so defining what that scope is. So when we talk about scope, it might be things like what time period does the data relate to, what population, what location, what system is being measured. Secondly, explaining any influencing factors. So when we are presenting that data, are there any particular events, any changes in policies, any conditions that might have affected why the data looks the way it does? Under this, we might also look at things like seasonal trends or external drivers. Thirdly, clarifying units and definitions, so being absolutely clear on what is being counted and what is being measured. If there's key terms that require definition, making sure that that is provided. If we are using numbers in our data, making sure we are being clear in terms of those numbers being percentages or rates or just raw figures. And then lastly, when we're planning for context, it can be really helpful to include some information on comparison and benchmarks. So thinking about how perhaps your data relates to similar data collected in previous time periods, or how it relates in comparison to targets, or how it relates to data that's been collected from other centres that are similar to the centre that you're reporting on. So thinking a little bit more about context and why providing that information on context matters so much. So firstly, it provides meaning. So without context, data is just numbers. The context explains why the data looks the way it does, such as the time period, the location, the influencing factors. So for example, if we were presenting data that showed a 20% increase in hospital admissions, this might mean success or it might mean concern, but it depends on whether it's related to, for example, an improvement initiative that's designed to improve access, or maybe it's in the context of a flu outbreak. So without knowing that context, you don't know what meaning to derive from that particular data. Secondly, it avoids misinterpretation. So without context, your audience may draw incorrect conclusions. So again, for example, if you presented data that showed a spike in costs, that automatically might be seen as a negative thing until you provide the context to say, actually, that increase is linked to a strategic investment that will reduce further costs and further expenses down the line. Thirdly, having that context means that we can support people make better decisions. It helps those decision makers understand the implications and act accordingly and appropriately to that data. Providing context also enhances communication. So the context makes the data relatable, easier to explain, particularly when we're thinking about audiences that might have a lower data literacy level. And finally, it also builds trust. So if we're providing that context, if we're demonstrating actively that transparency and that credibility, we are hopefully reducing any skepticism there might be about your data and hopefully increasing that confidence around those data-driven decisions. The last aspect that we wanted to get you thinking about was audience when you're creating your data stories. But first, we'd be really interested to hear from you about the different audiences that perhaps you've prepared data presentation or data reports for currently or in the past. So if you wouldn't mind sharing those in the chat, that would be fabulous.
So we've got trustees, children and young people, university executive team, board meetings, head of department, public program groups, special interest groups, senior leadership, students, clinical peers, NHS staff, patients, other professionals, ICB board, committees, delivery group, MPs, doctors, health and wellbeing practitioners, counsellors, operational team managers, cabinet committees, commercial funders. There's a huge list.
There's a huge range there, isn't there? Loads of things I hadn't thought of. So really nice to hear those coming through. So some of the things I've not had to prepare for as in terms of audience. So really nice to think about those. Really nice to see a lot of service user ones coming through as well. So thank you for sharing with us those different audience types that you've sort of done data presentations and data reports from, and hopefully that does sort of help to illustrate the breadth and depth of audience type that is out there when we're thinking about data in that health and care context. So in preparation for this, I just did a little bit of a brain dump on this particular slide with some ideas in terms of audiences that I've prepared reports for or I'm aware of from previous roles. But also acknowledging that when we talk about some of these categories, we could probably break them down even further. So, for example, if we think about clinical teams, we could break clinical teams down into the particular staff type, so be it doctors, nurses, AHPs, or we could break it down even further and think about specialty, so medical versus surgical, and break that down even further from there as well. So yeah, so what I'm hoping that we've illustrated here is the variety of the potential audience types out there and the different audiences that you might be preparing data stories for. So when we are creating our data stories, and we obviously want to make them as powerful as they possibly can be and make them as impactful as they possibly can be. So in order to support us with doing that, it's really important that we do take time to think about who our audience is going to be or will likely be, and try to tailor those narratives and those visuals accordingly to give you the best possible chance of making the connections with your audience that you're hoping or aiming to make. So when we talk about tailoring, there's a few points that perhaps if we consider as part of our planning when we are thinking about putting that data story together, that will help us to do that tailoring much more effectively. So firstly, thinking about needs. So what is the needs, the interest, the drivers, the challenges for your particular audience? So for example, if we are thinking about a data report that's communicating the impact from a new service, the needs and the interest of a commissioner might be quite different to those of a service user, to those of someone that works within that service, or maybe someone that's a regulatory body that works alongside that service. Secondly, we should be thinking about the role of your audience, either within the organisation directly or maybe wider within the system. And when we think about role, we perhaps can think about whether or not that audience has more of an influencing role or more of a decision-making role. So if you decide actually your audience is more in that influencing category, then perhaps the goal from our data story is about trying to inspire, maybe through personal stories or more person-centered data. And perhaps your call to action is more about sharing or endorsing messages or about starting conversations. If you decide actually your audience sits more within that decision-making category, then the goal might be much more about influencing policy, obtaining funding, about influencing strategic direction. So maybe your data will be much more of a data-driven narrative that presents clear evidence of outcomes and impacts, and that call to action is much more about approving something or funding something or supporting something being implemented. Thirdly, thinking about perspective. So what lens is it that your audience will be thinking through or looking through? So if we are thinking about an audience that has more of a strategic lens, then perhaps the primary focus is more about that system-wide impact and those longer-term outcomes. If your audience has more of a tactical lens, then they might be much more interested in things like daily performance, workforce, and resource allocation. Data literacy, so really important to think about what level of data literacy there is within your audience. And if we maintain those 4 data visualization principles we talked through earlier, if we're giving that really clear, good quality context, all those type of things help to support understanding, even with audiences that perhaps have lower levels of data literacy. Cultural and accessibility considerations. So are there any that we should be thinking about with our audience? If we can proactively be aware of the audience demographics, of the cultural backgrounds, that can help us to frame our message better and maybe even use examples within our narratives that perhaps are more relevant to our audience and therefore hopefully will land better. We should also be thinking about the use of inclusive language. So think about the language that you're using and the terms that you're using. So for example, if you are writing reports on a service that's focused on older people, and you're using the term frailty, for example, how might that term be received by a public group? If you are reporting on data that's related to ethnic categories, think about what your wording is, your language is. Again, likewise with things like socioeconomic groups and social inequalities. And think about how terms such as hard to reach communities might land with people, and just try and think about how that language might be received, and think about whether there's better ways, more inclusive ways of reframing that language. And then last of all, think about your audience in terms of what concerns they may have. So try and put yourself in the shoes of your audience just for a minute or two when you're doing that planning, and try to proactively anticipate what concerns and what questions your audience may have. And that just spending time on that means that you can address those proactively within your storytelling. And it just shows to your audience that you've taken the time and the effort to think about them and think about what their needs and their questions might be. So, summary slide, just before I hand back to Sarah for questions. Couple of points. Again, just remember that you're the narrator of your data story. So when you're creating that narrative, make sure you're building that narrative that has its hook, has flow, highlights those insights, and has that clear call to action. Make sure that we are keeping to those 4 data visualization principles when we're creating our data visuals. Making sure that we are providing contextual information. So we are supporting the audience with their interpretation and their understanding by providing that fuller picture within which they can place the data. When we are planning our reports, our presentations, our posters, whatever they may be, think about your audience, think about their needs and their role, and try to see how you can adjust your narrative to better meet the needs and land your message more securely. But I suppose above everything else, if you only take one message away, it's about making sure that when we are presenting or preparing these data stories, we're trying to keep things simple, we're trying to keep things clear, and we're trying to keep things concise. So we're supporting, going back to that very first quote, we're supporting as much as we possibly can with understanding. So, as Sarah mentioned at the start, you will be given access to a copy of these slides after the event. So this slide will be part of the slide deck, and within this, what we've tried to do is just give some links to some tools or some articles or some resources that, if this is a topic that you're particularly interested in, might be worth exploring a bit more and following up on some of those. So thank you very much for listening to me for the last 30 minutes or so. I hope something in there was of interest and of use, and just handing back to Sarah for questions.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And yes, there's lots and lots for folk to be thinking about. We've already got one chat question, I beg your pardon, in the chat. So just while people are thinking about their questions or any points they want to discuss or any observations, please do raise your electronic hand. But just thinking about so many points to consider and the importance, please use these slides, which, as Michelle's put in the chat, you'll have access to on Future NHS, but please use the slides as a real resource for you. So key things for me, just as folk are thinking about their questions, were tailoring to the audience. So we saw in the chat such a wealth of different audience folk, from executives to trustees to public service users. And that's really important when we think about how we might tailor our storytelling. So that storytelling, and I always remember as a young 20-year-old being so delighted that 95% of patients in a clinical audit had passed this evidence-based standard, until somebody pointed out to me, what about the other 5%? So getting that hook and tailoring your storytelling so that you really are thinking about the audience and thinking about how best to actually tell your story, have that hook. And also the importance of contextualizing data. So thinking about the meaning, avoiding misinterpretation. Some great points coming through from folk, looking at that pie chart that Sandra had up as an example, really, to sort of get you thinking about how you can show your data, but also thinking about the ways of showing the data. So huge thank you, Sandra. I've got no hands raised at the moment, so I'm going to go to the question that's in the chat from Sarah Diamont. Sarah, do you want to open mic and ask your question? Are you happy I read it out?
I'll ask the question. So I'm new to my role here. Previously worked with students, so help them navigate using ChatGPT when perhaps supporting them with CVs, applications, covering letters, that kind of thing. So I'm just wondering people's thoughts on using generative AI to visualize, data.
So I'm going to start, if that's okay, and then we'll open it up to Michelle and Sandra, and then perhaps to wider members within this community of practice, because we all learn from one another. So from NHS Dorset's perspective, we need to be very careful that the AI we're using is approved for use. So we use Copilot. I think it's very important that we are not always presuming that Copilot or whatever AI you're using is absolutely right. So you need to fact check. You also need to be open with the fact that you've used AI. So make sure you're referencing that in any reports or any papers you're doing, particularly for publications now. They are doing fact checks against AI, and is it actually something that you've written? So think about the data as well as what you're writing, but also from my perspective, not to blindly use AI and presume it's right. So think about what is being said and what are the key messages. Sandra, Michelle, is there anything you wanted to add to that before we open up to others for their thoughts?
I was going to say that I think AI can sometimes be useful for image creation. I know that comes with a whole separate debate around the energy usage of AI creating images, but sometimes I find that that's quite helpful. I think sometimes once you've done the, if you've kind of got an image that you kind of maybe want to create from it to have a visual to go with your storytelling, that can be quite useful. I've seen it really done in a very good way with the word clouds that Sandra presented, and it can be used for items like that. So I think sometimes that can be very useful, but agree with all the comments that Sarah made.
Thanks, Michelle. That's really helpful. Sandra, did you want to add anything?
I don't think so. I think Michelle and yourself have covered most of the things I want to say. I think for me, I find AI is quite, it's one source of information. So I wouldn't see it as the source of information, but it's a source. And sometimes it can help unblock things if you've got a bit of a mind block on something. I can add a few more ideas into the mix. I wouldn't see it as the start and the end point.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful, Sandra. We've got another point in the chat about, I just learned about compassion fade. Hannah, did you want to talk about that? Did you want to open mic?
Yeah, we're a charity that uses statistics about young people to sort of say why we exist. And so I was sort of looking for how to best display those on our website or other media. And so, yeah, just found out about this idea that it's not a great idea to use huge numbers, particularly even when you're talking about millions of people or something, because it's just not that relatable for people. So, yeah, that was just something that I thought might be helpful for people.
It's really helpful, thank you, because it adds yet another dynamic thinking about contextualizing the data. So thank you so much for that, Hannah. Okay, we've got one other point from Andy. So Andy's saying you may find Gen AI useful for ideating visuals free of confidential or specific data. Just thinking about that data. Andy, did you want to add to that? Do you want to open mic?
Yeah, to be honest, as I was typing it, someone pretty much made the same point. So not a huge amount to add, but yeah, just actually, when asking that question, it might be that we're thinking about using Gen AI for the end product, but actually sometimes it's useful earlier in the stages just to get some ideas of how things could look and play out. The only other point I'd add there is obviously don't forget every time we use AI, it's going to use a lot of energy, so use it wisely.
Absolutely. Thank you. I love that eco-friendly point that you've just made as well. Right, on another point as well, we've got to be very careful about how our data is being used. So if we're using an AI tool, what happens to the data? So think about, sensitive information. So be careful as you're using AI. So going to round up, we've just got a couple more points, and also to do a little promotion of our a free drop-in session that we've got for you and our next community of practice. But we're just going to open a poll, please, on Teams. If you can literally just spend just a minute to fill in our evaluation form. It's literally 6 quick questions. Thank you to Claire Lockhead, who has reminded us that NHS organisations will have a policy on AEI use. So that goes back to my point. Find out about what the policies are, make sure that you're utilising the right AI and any other software that you're doing. Just coming through this on my screen. Sandra, you're right to go to the next slide, please, just as folk are filling this out. Thank you. So if you weren't already aware, because you've attended this community of practice, we'd like to promote a free drop-in session. So that's just a quick half-an-hour drop-in session. So if you're actually working on a report, you feel that it will be helpful to have a discussion, do drop in. We're open for any questions. It'll be Sandra and I ready to help you. It's just there as an additional if you would like. And any other queries, please do email us at Dorset Innovation Hub at nhsdorset.nhs.uk. And please do spread the word about the events that we do. Next slide, please. And then just thinking about our next community of practice, just wanted to note the next community of practice, which is influencing, so shaping outcomes through communications and relationships. So that's the 24th of March at 1 o'clock. So please do spread the word about that community of practice. And then next slide, I think, is our last slide. So thank you very much. Wishing everyone a lovely rest of your afternoon. And as promised, we have got you off on time. Just as you're signing off, many of you were talking about wanting to improve data storytelling, thinking about data for influencing, thinking about data, bringing it to life with real stories and making it more alive. That came across from many of you. So I hope you got some top tips there, and any queries do follow, do come to our drop-in session 11th of February, or don't be a stranger, just email Sandra or myself with any of your queries. So wishing you an amazing rest of your afternoon, and thank you so much. Bye-bye.